Wolf Riders. Dear Scary Stories NYC. My mother used to tell people that I had imaginary werewolf friends. That wasn't true at all. I had very real friends who rode large wolves. Could those have been werewolves? I'm not sure. I just remember that the ladies were the most beautiful people I'd ever seen. And the wolves were all taller than I was in those days. This happened during the 3 summers that my mother and I spent living with our elderly relative. I was a girl of 13 that first summer, far too old to be having imaginary friends. Either those were real people of some sort, or maybe there was something intoxicating in the atmosphere of those woods, because I continued to see them when I was 14 and 15 as well. They were only there in the spring and summer. They left sometime early in autumn, and I don't know if they went south or just went indoors when it got cold. Our sickly relative lived off Chandler Hill Road, near Gaylord State Forest area in Michigan. When I say she lived off the road, I mean she lived down a dirt road from the main highway. In the summer, those woods were fairly impenetrable because of the overgrowth of vegetation, and in the winter, because of the snow and cold weather. If I'm 83 now, then that means it's 70 years since my first summer in those woods, and over 60 years since the house burned down. I'd advise you not to go looking for it. The last person I know of who did go search for the remains of that building told me he fell down into the basement before he realized he was standing right where the old house used to be. That must have been the late 70s, early 80s. I don't know if there's anyone left alive but me that can remember that there used to be a house back up there in that forest. The Wolf Riders never came too close to the house, to be honest. I would be wandering alone in the trees when we would come upon each other. The first time I saw them, there were a bunch of beautiful older girls, all standing in a circle around another beautiful young woman. And they were all blonde, and had an unearthly kind of beauty to them. When they spoke, with their strange accent though, their words were harsh and cruel. They each in turn pointed at the girl in the center of the circle and stated loudly that this girl had committed some offense. She had hoarded food, said one girl. Another pointed at her and accused her of being vain. Several of the others concurred on that accusation. The volume of surly comments grew louder, and they began speaking over each other. Meanwhile, the sad, lonely girl at the center of the circle was crying and whimpering, begging for mercy. I felt terrible, so I burst out of my hiding spot and I ran to her. I didn't know that young woman, but I was a kid and I felt sorry. I threw my arms around her and I asked them if they couldn't see that she was sad and sorry about what she had done. They all shut up for a second, looked at each other, and burst out laughing. I was confused. The girl they had been shouting mean things at joined in with the laughter. Then she told me that they were just playing Crow's Court, and it was her turn to get to be the bad crow. She complimented me for my bravery, charging out into a group of wolf riders as I had done. I asked her what she was talking about, and she walked me a ways further into the woods. That was when I noticed the large wolves. They must have been standing there the entire time, but I hadn't noticed them until they were pointed out to me. I was probably just being inobservant, but to me at the time, it was like magic when she showed me that wolves as large as horses had been standing 40 or 50 feet away from me the entire time I'd been watching their Crow's Court game. How had I not heard them? How had I not smelled them? They smelled like backstage at the circus, if any of you are old enough to remember real circuses with trained animal acts. A couple of the wolves were larger than horses. Not quite elephant-sized, but larger than horses, that was for certain. I asked if I could ride one of the wolves, and they said I was too young. I asked if I could join them and run away with them. That made them all laugh, and they had the most beautiful kind of laughter. I asked again, telling them that I wanted to listen to their laughter for the rest of my life. I was told that I should be careful what I wish for. They began mounting their canine steeds, and I felt so sad. I asked them if I could please see them again, and they all looked to this one girl, so I knew she was the leader. She looked unhappy to have to deal with this, but it was clear the other girls wanted me to be able to meet with them again. The leaders said it might not be good for me, that I was both too old and too young to be seeing them in the first place. I don't really know what that meant, but each of the 3 summers, at least one of the wolf riders called me, both too old and too young, to be there with them. I would laugh when they would say things like that. Only kids or older people can see them? I figured they were some sort of self-absorbed rich girls, claiming magical powers for themselves, and then humoring each other about their great abilities and their magical prowess. I so wanted to go with them, to live whatever kind of life they were leading. They must have had rich fathers to afford such large, lovely, and well-trained wolves. I thought they must live in houses with servants and chocolate bonbons. I suspected they might have desserts with French names served on silver platters. When I was 1 year older, though, I encountered them again and was brought to what they described as a feast. There were no chocolate bonbons there. This was a feast cooked in a cauldron over a fire. It smelled good, but when I asked what was inside it, the response I received was, "What isn't inside it?" That was an answer that made me shudder. But when I got hungry enough, I ate their meat soup. It had things in it that looked like weeds and roots to me, but they tasted like nothing I had ever had before. We went to sleep under the stars with no tents or beds. When I complained of the ground being too hard to sleep, I was told to ask the grass to become softer. When I complained that I was cold, I was told to ask the woods to warm me up. When I complained to a second person, they gave me the same advice as the first one. I thought I was being made fun of, until I overheard another girl asking the grass to please warm up a bit. So I asked the grass to soften, and I asked the woods to warm up. Everybody laughed at me. Good and long and hard. Then someone threw me a blanket to wrap myself up in, and we all went back to sleep. I never knew what was real when I was around them, but I can't say I really minded it all that much. That summer, when I was a year older, they started to teach me to ride their youngest and smallest wolf. He would never go above a trot, and he bit me once. I was told I should say he only bit me once, and to focus on not annoying him, so he wouldn't bite me a second time. None of the wolves bit me a second time because I did learn how to do things in the way they liked. They actually enjoyed us riding them, as long as we did it the right way. You had to pay attention to them and their subtle changes, just as they paid attention to you as you rode them. There were also cues they gave that you needed to immediately shut your mouth and become alert to. My grandson has a car with motion picture cameras hidden inside of it somewhere, so he can watch all these little TV shows about what's happening outside the glass windows that he could be looking out of instead. Well, when we rode those big wolves, they were our 360-degree motion picture camera system, so when they told you to pay attention, you had to do so immediately. We would encounter things in the woods which would sometimes require us to hide, or possibly to run away. One time we sneaked away when the wolves signaled to us that some large predator was nearby. I never found out if it was a bear, or a big cat, or what. I mean, what would be such a problem that these horse-sized carnivores would want to avoid it? It just dawned on me after 7 decades that they might have been afraid of mankind. Maybe there were hunters ahead. I sometimes forget that we humans eat meat too. At least at the time I'm writing this, we're still doing it. When I was young, I always had hair that some people described as light brown and others called reddish blonde. These days they call it whatever name it says on the bottle, but back then my hair would be darker in the winter and blonder as the summer wore on. My family told me it was because I was out in the sun, but I felt it was because of those blonde wolf girls. Their wolves were blonde too. I had never seen that before. Even if they had been normal-sized wolves, they would have been remarkable to look at. Their eyes were not pink, so they were not albino. They just had pale fur like polar bears. They were so soft to the touch, and I learned how to be trusted enough by them that I could brush them and delouse them. Laugh all you want. I knew that if they were letting me pick their ticks and fleas off, that meant we were friends. The last summer I got to see them went by so fast. It was all over by the morning. I had noticed the prior summer that when I would come home from seeing the wolf girls, more time would have passed than I had expected. I thought it was just me being tardy and getting lost in my fun times. Everyone else thought so too, and it wasn't a big deal. But then my last summer in those woods, the girls didn't just invite me to their camp. They took me away with them to show me their world. When they returned me the next morning, summer had gone. My mom screamed and cried when I showed up. She and our elderly relative had thought I was gone. They thought I was lost forever. You see, to them, almost 2 months had passed since they had last seen me. For me, it was only one night, maybe 10 hours max. I tried to explain, and they tried to explain, but it was like we were speaking different languages to each other. I was banished from leaving the house except to use the outhouse, but I felt I could understand their reaction. My mother and our relative didn't even want me leaving the premises. They wanted me where they could see me. That was how they put it at the time. And they would stare at me too, usually with baleful looks on their faces, shaking their heads with disbelief. Maybe I shouldn't have told my mother that I spent the night with the wolf riders, and that they took me to their home. The girls had warned me that time moves differently for them. I asked them to explain what that meant, but they just laughed at me and said I wouldn't understand. I remember telling them that I was old enough to get it, but they said our entire species wasn't old enough yet to get it, and that also seemed funny to the girls. My grandson refers to the wolf riders as living in another dimension. That doesn't really make sense to me, as it's not like we rode a rocket ship to get there. We just walked. We walked from the area behind my family's property down a path, a dirt road. It wasn't a yellow brick road to Never Neverland. It was just a dirt road made of dirt, and we walked on it. There were no flashing lights. There was no spooky mumbo-jumbo. I didn't see reality fall apart and rejoin with itself. It was like a dirt road through the summer woods that led to the most beautiful place you can possibly imagine. I used to watch that program Fantasy Island because it reminded me of that valley. Well, also because I had a crush on Ricardo Montalban, but it was that Garden of Eden quality to the show that first got me to watch it. And that was what it felt like in the place where those wolf girls lived. It felt fantastic. It felt wonderful, exhilarating, exciting. None of these words suffice. The air was better there. Everything was superior. But I would need a new language to explain it. I think I was in my 30s or 40s when VHS tapes came out, but for the first time, I had something to compare to the experience of being in that forest that night that lasted 7 weeks. Unfortunately, now VHS technology is so old that I don't know if any of you will even know what I'm talking about. Nevertheless, I shall endeavor. And whether you remember or not, VHS tapes could be recorded on the 2-hour mode, or the 4-hour mode, or the 6-hour mode. You could fit 3 times as much stuff on the 6-hour mode, but the quality of the 2-hour mode was far superior. Well, our ordinary life is sort of like living inside the 6-hour mode, and when you step into the Wolf Rider world, it's in the 2-hour mode, and 3 times as real as what you had thought of as reality before. That's the closest I've ever come to really explaining what it felt like to be there with them that night. It was worth trading in the entire summer to get to experience that, as I now have a standard to hold heaven to after I die. It had better be at least as wonderful as the place the Wolf Riders lived in back then. The night the Wolf Riders brought me into their world was a storytelling night. They took turns telling stories they knew by heart. Some of them were history lessons about their tribe. Some were entertaining stories about ancestors whose names I was unfamiliar with. That was the night when they told me the story of how they became an all-female tribe. See, once long ago, they were a race of people not too dissimilar to us humans. They bred like cockroaches, I was told. That seemed very funny to the wolf riders. They started to take over that forest, and so the forest itself decided to turn their men into those giant wolves. So then I laughed at them. I knew about the birds and the bees by my third summer in that place. I knew they couldn't have babies if they had no men. They would go away after their generation died off without men. But that is why the forest made us immortal, was my answer. This time the expected laughter didn't come. They weren't kidding. They and their wolves didn't need babies to carry their race on. They just weren't ever gonna die, you see. And it was the matter-of-factness about it that eventually let it sink in. This was the one time they weren't kidding around. The trickster trick this time was that they actually meant what they were saying. They were expecting to live forever. Somewhere in another reality that you could walk to on foot in only a few minutes, they were expecting to live forever. Just a short walk from our backyard were eternal beings, riding huge blonde wolves that were once their husbands a long, long time ago, in another life. But then nature itself decided it should be different. When I told my mother all this, she told me to be quiet and do my chores. So I didn't know that my time visiting their world with those girls was my last. And I suppose I'm lucky I didn't know about it. We had fun and talked about things we would do again the following summer. My elderly relative passed on that next winter, though. And we took what we could from our house to move to our next tiny little place, which was in Wisconsin. It was in a poor part of the suburbs. We had big carnivores there too, but they were mostly the human kind. Sometimes I think that maybe I should go back to those woods and look for those girls. I bet they look the same as they did back then, or maybe a few months older. Maybe if I found them, they would let me travel with them, and maybe then I could live on forever just like them. Or maybe I'd slip and slide down into the basement of the old home I used to live in before I even realized where I was, just like that fellow did back in the late 70s or early 80s. Only at my age, that would end up being my final resting place. Still, if I'm feeling strong in the spring, I sure would love to go back to that ancient place. I don't think I'm still agile enough to get into the parts of the woods that the girls live in, but maybe if I'm lucky, and if I sit quietly enough, I'll be able to hear them playing Crow's Court one more time. And maybe I'll have one more chance to hear the laughter of the Wolf Riders. Hey, I just want to say I've been reading this fascinating book about the dogmen and werewolves, written by the late Linda Godfrey. It's a real classic on the subject. I've noticed that there are some sharp discrepancies between her version of a certain famous classic dogman appearance in the 20th century and the History Channel's version of the same event. I'm working on a semi-animated episode using maps and imagery to illustrate visually the two different versions as they're explained. Try to get closer to the truth than possibly anyone has ever gotten before. You know you can get the audiobook version of this important book for only $6 if you follow the link in the description, and you help out our channel if you do. And now for something completely hairy. This story is dedicated to Angie K. How could it be any other way? Well, this episode tonight was requested by Angie K something like a month ago, but it finally came to fruition tonight. I hope you liked it, Angie, just as I hope you like our new secret members only episode we're dropping tonight, called The Old Werewolf versus the Dogman. Since you're a channel member, Angie, you get to see it. For the rest of you listening, there are two ways you can join, either using YouTube or PayPal. And here to explain how that works is our international TV spokesmongrel, Henry Lee Dogman. Hank?
Thanks, Biggie. And thanks to all of you for watching this far. If you liked it,
please click like. If you'd like to see more of our work, please subscribe. And also click that bell icon if you'd like to be notified when we put out a new episode. To become an executive producer, you can donate to us through the thanks button under each of our videos or through our paypal.me/PeterBernard209 page. To receive cool perks like secret uncensored Dogman episodes far too wild to ever run on this channel, you can become a YouTube channel member by clicking the join button, or join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. Joining either at the $3 a month level or above gets you access to our over 25 hours of secret uncensored Dogman stories available nowhere else. Do you have a scary story about Dogman or some other kind of high strangeness that happened to you? Let us know by emailing us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or by leaving us a voicemail message at 804-LA-SCARY. You may need to call back on that one. It cuts off after, I think, 3 minutes. And if you don't want to do any of that stuff, thank you for simply watching to the end. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.